Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Chan, Assistant Curator of International Programs at the Hong Kong Museum of Art. So welcome back to our talk series. This is our second part. The first part was held last week, and we were very happy that we received very good responses. So it's my honor to be the moderator again for this talk, which is organized by the museum for the exhibition, the Hong Kong Jockey Club series, Botticelli and His Times, Masterworks from the Uffizi. So for those who did not attend our live streaming talk series last week, this exhibition is solely sponsored by the Hong Kong Jockey Club Charity Trust, jointly presented by the Leisure and Cultural Services Department and the Ministry of Cultural Heritage and Activities and Tourism of Italy. So it's also jointly organized by the Hong Kong Museum of Art and the Uffizi Galleries, in collaboration with the Consulate General of Italy in Hong Kong and the Chinese Italian Cultural Society. So we also have the First Initiative Foundation as our community partner, and it's supported by the Italian Cultural Institute in Hong Kong. And it's also part of the program of Italia Mia. So we're delighted to have the Italian Cultural Institute providing this platform for us for today's live streaming section. Thank you so much for the support. So first of all, let me introduce, for today's speakers, Professor Alessandro De Croce and Dr. Marco Caboara. So let me introduce you for our first speaker, Professor Alessandro De Croce. So she's a research assistant professor of Western art at Lingnan University, trained as an art historian at La Sapienza University in Rome and Columbia University in New York. She specializes in Italian art from the 14th to the 18th century, with a major focus on the Italian Renaissance. So she was also involved in a number of curatorial projects and is currently working on a book on historical truth and narrative painting in post-Reformation Italian art. And she's also now finishing 2 articles on late 16th century art and antiquarianism in Rome. So please join me and welcome Professor De Croce today to present her topic, For Antique Objects Embody Complete Artistic Perfection, the Allure of Antiquity in Renaissance Art. Professor De Croce, please.
Thank you. Thank you to the Hong Kong Museum of Art and to Dr. Amy Chan for this opportunity. And thank you to all of you who joined virtually today. So antiquity in the Renaissance, quite a vast and complex topic. We're just going to scratch a little bit the surface of it. So amongst the many works gathered here for the Botticelli exhibition, there is the Adoration of the Magi that was commissioned to Botticelli in 1474 by the Florentine Giovanni or Gaspare dell'Ama, who was a close associate of the Medici. The painting was a success. As Giorgio Vasari tells us, it was a very much appreciated painting, mainly because of its innovative composition. But today, we're not going to talk about this painting in detail. Instead, we're going to look at a small architectural fragment that is in the background to the left of the painting. It is an architectural fragment that we immediately recognize as ancient architecture because of the white color, which is, of course, a reference to the marble largely used in antiquity, and because of the arches. Now, a fragment of ancient architecture within a religious composition had a very specific and well-established symbolic meaning. It was a symbol of the ancient pagan world being replaced or about to be replaced by the new Christian world. In this case, the new Christian world was, of course, announced by the birth of baby Jesus. But this fragment of ancient architecture was also a tribute to the ancient world itself, which was, of course, a lost world, but it was still seen as the highest point ever reached by human civilization in all of its manifestations, including, of course, the visual arts. Since the late 14th century onwards, those art objects that had luckily survived the destruction of time began to be regarded with a new interest, a new curiosity. Especially artists began to study them, to look at them, to copy, draw, imitate their language. And in doing so, they were developing a new artistic language that was better suited to visualize a new notion of art based on the idea of the imitation of the natural world, but filtered through the idealized forms of classical art. Now, for a long period of time during the Middle Ages, there was not awareness of what we might call historical distance. In other words, there wasn't a clear understanding of the distance, the fracture between the ancient times and the present time. There was, of course, a good understanding of the religious fracture, the shift from paganism to Christianity. But medieval men considered themselves the heirs of the ancient Romans. A good example is this 12th century seal of the German Emperor Frederick I, which has on one side the portrait of the emperor himself, holding the insignia of the imperial authority. And on the other side, there is a cityscape that we easily recognize as the city of Rome itself. The name of the city is actually clearly indicated here, but there is also very peculiar architectural structure, which is round. It has a number of arches. This is, of course, a reference to the Colosseum, which was and still is one of the most recognizable monuments of the city of Rome. The Latin inscription around it reads Roma caput mundi, Rome, capital of the world. It is a reference to the powerful symbolic image of Rome as the capital of the entire world. Just like in antiquity, Rome had been the capital of the Roman Empire. Of course, it's just a symbolic image. Medieval Rome was a ghost, a shadow of the ancient imperial city, but it was a powerful symbol. And it is not by chance that the Holy Roman emperors used it as a way to legitimize their own imperial authority by emphasizing the connection with the Roman Empire. It was in the late 14th century, however, that a new generation of scholars that we call humanists began fully aware of the distance from the past and understood that the ancient past was different. In other words, they historicized the past. They understood that it was necessary to study that ancient time, to investigate it in order to reconstruct it and understand it as much as possible. So they began to search for ancient texts, for instance, usually preserved in old medieval manuscripts. But they also began interested in a different category of evidence of the past, that is to say, material evidence, physical fragments of that ancient past. For instance, architectural fragments that had remained always visible, but largely neglected, acquired a new importance in the eyes of these scholars who tried to investigate, to study antiquity. Columns or capitals, for instance, who were often reused in Christian buildings. So what you're seeing on the screen are two Roman churches. They look quite similar, but there is quite a chronological distance between the two of them. The first one, Santa Sabina, was built in the early 5th century. The second one dates back to the 11th century. But in both cases, the beautiful columns, the capitals, were taken from nearby old Roman buildings. Larger architectural fragments were also visible in many cities of the former Roman Empire, and especially in Rome, of course. So on the screen is a beautiful drawing by a northern artist, Marten van Heemskerk, who in the 1530s traveled to Rome in order to study antiquity. And luckily, he left a number of drawings that are particularly interesting as they sort of photograph the situation of antiquity and the ancient remains in Rome at that time. And you can see this is a view of the Roman Forum with what looks like the Arch of Constantine, a monument that is still visible today. Other objects that began to be particularly valued as both historical documents who could provide precious information about the past, but also as art objects, were precious gems and cameos, inscriptions, and coins. All, not always for inscriptions, but obviously gems and coins were very small objects that could be easily collected, easily transported. So there was a great circulation of these objects. Now, cameos, such as the one you see on the screen, which dates to the 1st century AD, and it bears the profile portrait of the Emperor Augustus, were very precious objects, and they were very much sought after by collectors. Inscriptions and coins, however, were more interesting, both to antiquarians and scholars in general who studied antiquity, and artists. They provided material, textual, and visual evidence. For instance, an inscription, a Latin inscription, is not just about the textual information, but it is also about the lettering, the shape, the size of the letters. And an inscription is often found on a monument, on an architectural monument. So artists were often copying inscriptions as some sort of decorative element of a larger monument, as it is the case of these two drawings by Martin van Heemskerk. The first one, in particular, the Arch of Titus in the Roman Forum, is very interesting because he copies the inscription, but he simply copied the lettering of the original inscription in the first word, senatus. The rest of the inscription is in his own handwriting, as if he didn't have the time to carefully copy all of the letters, which instead he did in the drawing of the Pantheon. As for coins, of course, the most interesting element was the likeness of the emperor or member of the imperial family that we find in coins. For historians and antiquarians, the likeness of the emperor provided a very precious information because it was possible to use ancient coins to identify, for instance, marble busts or heads or even freestanding entire sculptures that had survived without any identification. A good example of what coins could do is in the late 16th century antiquarium in Munich, Germany, where the Duke Albrecht V housed his large collection of Roman busts, each one of them with its own identification. And of course, the sort of visual ontology of the Roman emperors would not have been possible without coins. But coins were also of great interest for artists. In particular, it is very possible that coins, ancient Roman coins, sort of inspired the invention, so to speak, of a new object, the medal. A medal is a sort of, looks very much like a coin indeed. It has the profile portrait of the person to whom the medal is dedicated on one side, and on the other side, there is usually some sort of allegorical depiction that has to do with the person. The first Renaissance medal is usually considered to be the one that you see here on the screen by the northern Italian artist Pisanello. He was actually a painter, but we know that he was also a collector of ancient coins. He owned a decently sized collection of coins. And so it is certainly not by chance that he's also the artist credited with the invention of the medal. This medal here shows you the likeness of the Byzantine emperor, John VIII Palaeologus, who in 1438 was in Italy. Quite rapidly, medals became very popular, and they remained popular all the way to the 20th century, really. In Medici Florence, their medals were also particularly appreciated. And just to give you an example, this is a medal with the likeness of Lorenzo the Magnificent. But medals were not just political objects, or they were not just dedicated to public figures. There were also medals that were more of a private object. For instance, this medal here, dedicated to Giovanna degli Albizzi Tornabuoni. She was a young Florentine noblewoman who married a member of the Tornabuoni family in 1486. And that's when this medal was cast as a way to remember and commemorate this private event, of course, which was the wedding between these two people. Medals were also very good objects to signal some sort of political alliance or loyalty. And in around 1475, Sandro Botticelli paints this beautiful portrait of a young man whose identity remains unknown. But we know for sure that he was very loyal to the Medici family. He's showing off the medal with the likeness of Cosimo the Elder, Cosimo de' Medici, the patriarch of the family, in a very clear and unmistakable political statement. But the group of ancient objects that probably had the biggest impact on Renaissance artists were, of course, the large freestanding sculptures. Many of the sculptures were found underground, and we have several accounts of discoveries that happened in the 16th century of beautiful and almost miraculously preserved sculptures. But then there were many other sculptures that had remained visible throughout the Middle Ages. It's just that no one had really paid attention to them. So all of a sudden, in the from the early 15th century, artists began to look at these new objects. So I'm going to show you a few examples of sculptures that had a crucial role for many 15th century artists. And let's begin with this imposing equestrian monument of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. This equestrian monument had always remained visible in Rome, but it was only in the 15th century that began noticed again. It is today preserved in a museum, and outside in the piazza of the capital, the Campidoglio, there is a copy. So the Marcus Aurelius inspired several equestrian monuments of the early Renaissance. For instance, a painted one by Paolo Uccello, which celebrates the English military captain John Hawkwood, and it's painted in the Cathedral of Florence. And I think you can easily see how the painted monument is based on the imitation of the Marcus Aurelius. If you look at the position of the horse, the sense of life and movement that is very similar to what we see in the Marcus Aurelius. And even the color with this greenish hue is meant to remind the viewers of the material, the bronze. But perhaps the most impressive early Renaissance monument inspired by the Marcus Aurelius is the equestrian monument by the sculptor Donatello in Padua, celebrating the Gattamelata. He was another military captain from central Italy. Gattamelata is a nickname. It means honeyed cat. And he was in the service of the Venetian Republic, and Padua was one of the cities belonging to the Venetian Republic. That's why his monument is there. And in this case, not only Donatello was obviously looking at the Marcus Aurelius, he also used the same technique, which is called the lost wax technique, which was the typical technique used in antiquity for bronze monuments. But during the Middle Ages, the technological skills necessary to create such large bronze monuments was lost. So Donatello's equestrian monument of Gattamelata is the first example of a Renaissance bronze monument made with the same technique used in antiquity. We know that Donatello went to Rome, so there's no doubt that Donatello spent quite a long time looking at and studying these objects. Another sculpture that was very famous in the early 15th century and throughout the century really remained one of the most imitated and copied ancient sculptures is the so-called Spinarius. There are several copies, but perhaps the one in Rome is the oldest one. Now, what is interesting about the Spinarius is that there isn't any ancient textual source that explains the meaning of this sculpture. In other words, we don't know of any specific identity or content related to this young boy who's trying to take out a thorn from his foot. However, the lack of a specific content or connection with a specific character makes it the ideal motif that can be taken out from a context and easily readjusted to many different contexts. So we found, for instance, a direct quotation of the Spinarius in this panel that the Florentine architect Filippo Brunelleschi made in 1401 for a public contest for the doors of the baptistry in Florence. He was not selected, so he didn't win the commission, but luckily enough, the panel survived. And as you can see right here in the foreground, to the left, there is a direct quotation of the Spinarius. The Spinarius is also found in one of the frescoes that Botticelli himself painted in the Sistine Chapel. In these trials of Moses in the background, we see Moses taking off his shoes to be in the presence of God. And this is obviously reminiscent of the position of the Spinarius. Although obviously Botticelli is manipulating and adapting and adjusting the ancient model to what he needed. Quite interesting, I think. There are two more frescoes in the Sistine Chapel that where the Spinarius appears, one by Luca Signorelli, one by Pietro Perugino. This is an interesting visual information because obviously it tells us that this group of artists sent by Lorenzo de' Medici to Rome to decorate the Sistine Chapel in response to a request from the Pope, take advantage of their stay in the city and obviously went to look at many of the famous ancient sculptures that were available. And so they made sure to somehow, indicate their interest in antiquity by including the quotation of the Spinarius. If we now jump forward in time and we get to the beginning of the 16th century, I want to show you three more sculptures that had a crucial role in what we call the High Renaissance, that is to say, the elaboration of the style of artists such as Michelangelo, for instance, these giants of the Italian Renaissance. All of them are actually marble sculptures, so it's a different medium, and they belonged to the collection of the popes. They're still today in the Vatican Museum, by the way, so they have remained in the same location since then. And they are the so-called Belvedere Apollo, the Belvedere Torso, which I briefly showed you earlier, and the Laucon, one of the most impressive and majestic groups of antiquity, of ancient sculpture. So let's begin with the Belvedere Torso, which was excavated in Rome in the 1430s, but it was only really noticed in the early 16th century. One of the first drawings that shows us the Belvedere Torso is a drawing by Amico Aspertini, and you have it here on the left. But it is a very strange drawing. It's a very quick, almost a sketch. It doesn't look like the artist was actually studying or truly paying attention to the sculpture. It looks more like a sort of visual memo of the many ancient marbles that he had seen in the city. Very different from the drawing by Martin van Heemskerk, which instead clearly shows the attention and the careful study of the ancient marble from the part of the artist. You can look at the shading, for instance, with which he tries to replicate the modeling, the volumetric modeling of the back of the torso. In the center, this is actually an engraving, so it's not a drawing, but I think it's very interesting. It shows you the torso with a new pair of legs. This is an example of the type of restoration that was often designed for these fragmentary and mutilated ancient objects. So many artists tried to reimagine how that sculpture would be completed. So in the case of the Belvedere torso, it was necessary to imagine the position of the legs, the arms, the head. So this is a drawing that gives you a sense of that. And then Michelangelo. Michelangelo was, throughout his career, Michelangelo was deeply influenced by ancient art. Although he always had a very independent and highly personal way to engage with antiquity. So for instance, the Belvedere torso was something that he looked at and imitated a lot in the Sistine, for the decoration of the Sistine ceiling in the Sistine Chapel. Just to give you an idea, these are two of the many preparatory drawings that he made for the Sistine ceiling. And again, I think you can see by yourself how similar the drawings are to the actual bust. There is obviously a lot of time and attention that the artist spent in looking, studying, imitating this ancient marble. And these are the two finished figures. These are two of the so-called ignudi, which the naked young men that appear on the Sistine ceiling. We're not very sure what the symbolic religious meaning of this powerful young naked male bodies might be. They certainly show Michelangelo's skill in representing human anatomy. And Michelangelo continued to be inspired and to look at the Belvedere torso for a long time. When in the 1530s, he went back to the Sistine Chapel to decorate the altar wall with the famous Last Judgment, he's still looking or thinking about the Belvedere torso in the figure of Christ, in the figure of Saint Bartholomew, even though, of course, his pictorial language has changed dramatically from the earlier Sistine ceiling. But the sculpture that was probably the most important and the most significant for Michelangelo was the Laucon. Now, the Laucon was excavated in Rome in 1506. We know a great deal about this event, which caused a sensation. This impressive group was excavated, and the news traveled fast. Even the Pope was immediately intrigued and sent one of his artists to look at the sculpture and to evaluate it. And of course, the opinion of the artist was so good that the Pope, Julius II, immediately acquired the sculpture for his collection. Along with the papal artist who went to look at the sculpture, there was another young artist, which was Michelangelo himself. So he was one of the first artists in Italy to look at this impressive group. But he was certainly not the only one who was, very much impressed by it. Not even 2 years after the discovery, the Laucon is directly quoted in a relief made in Ferrara by a Lombard artist, so someone who had not been to Rome, but obviously knew very well the sculptural group. The Venetian painter Titian, who was a bit of a sort of counterpart to Michelangelo. He also lived a long life. He was one of the most famous artists of his time. He never traveled to Rome, but in 1520, he inserts the figure of the Laucon in one of his mythological paintings. With some adjustment, of course. The position of the leg is slightly different, and he rearranged the snakes around the bust of the Laucon. But there's no doubt that this is a direct quotation. And as late as 1589, 1590, this painting by Titian is recorded in an inventory as the painting by Titian with the Laucon. So there's no doubt about it. Around the same time, in a religious painting, he's still using the Laucon in the figure on the side panel, the figure of Saint Sebastian. Perhaps not so much a direct quotation, but definitely this physical struggle, the tension of these muscles that try to get rid of the constraints is very similar to what we see in the Laucon. And this is exactly the kind of inspiration that Michelangelo found in this ancient group. As I mentioned earlier, he was never someone to copy directly from the ancient models. He would always re-elaborate and readjust the form and the appearance of the ancient object to his own creative language. But if we look at a drawing like the Crucifixion from the early 1540s, we notice that Christ on the cross seems to be almost rebelling to his fate. He appears to be struggling against, what keeps him on the cross. He seems to be fighting against this horrible death. But then, of course, he accepts it. That's his fate. The same kind of powerful and yet powerless physical struggle, we find it in a much earlier work by Michelangelo, a freestanding sculpture that dates back to the second decade of the century, in which the so-called slave is again struggling against something. Once again, we notice the powerful muscles that are activated, they're moving because of the movement of the body. In both cases, although they're very distant, very different, there is this idea of the human body which becomes a vehicle of expression of emotions, of what is happening inside the body itself. And this tension between the body and the mind, the body and the soul that is expressed in these works by Michelangelo is something that he found in the Laucon. Michelangelo had always had a very independent relationship with antiquity since his very first work. This is the statue of Bacchus that was commissioned to a very young Michelangelo in 1496 in Rome. Michelangelo was at the time 21, 22 years old, and that was his first stay in Rome. Cardinal Riario, a very powerful Roman cardinal, who was also a well-known and avid collector of antiquities, commissioned Michelangelo the sculpture of an ancient god to be placed along with the ancient classical sculptures as part of his collection. And this is what Michelangelo did. It was not exactly a success. The sculpture was rejected. The cardinal refused to pay for it. So even Michelangelo's beginnings were not as easy as one might imagine. We don't know why the cardinal rejected this sculpture. One possible explanation, which I personally find very interesting, is that this was not what the good cardinal had in mind. Now, if we compare Michelangelo's Bacchus with something like the Belvedere Apollo, which was not part of the cardinal's collection, but we might imagine that a similar sculpture was in his collection, I think we can understand why the cardinal was not happy. Bacchus' body is a young body, but it is not exactly an ideal body, just like Apollo's, right? It's a bit too soft, it's a bit too chubby, almost feminine in certain areas. And the position of Bacchus, which is, of course, the so-called contrapposto position, typical position of ancient sculptures with the weight on one leg, doesn't communicate a sense of stability and powerful control as in the Belvedere Apollo. Rather, it seems that he's about to stumble almost. And if we consider the fact that he's holding a cup, most likely containing some wine, we might assume that he's a bit tipsy. Clearly he likes wine. He's the god of wine. So maybe he liked wine a bit too much, which might also explain the less than ideal shape of his body. It was a genius way from the part of such a young artist to manipulate and adapt the formal language of ancient sculptures. But of course, the cardinal was not particularly pleased. Perhaps that was the reason. We don't know, really. In any case, the sculpture was appreciated by someone else. And in the 1530s, our Martin van Heemskerk saw it in the collection of the Galli family in Rome. I just want to call your attention to the fact that he draws the bacchus with a broken arm, because that's a way to signal the antiquity of the sculpture. An ancient sculpture has to be somehow a fragment. It cannot be whole, right? So in order to pretend that it's an ancient object, it has to miss some bodily part. And, Michelangelo was 21, 22 years old when he made the Bacchus. He was at his first stay in Rome, but his personal and very independent relationship with antiquity had started earlier in the Medici Florence, where he was allowed to study in the garden of the Medici family and study their own collection of antiquities. And with a young Michelangelo at work in the Medici garden, we go back to Botticelli's Florence. It is very strange that Botticelli's own relationship with antiquity was somehow not what we might expect from a late 15th century artist working in Florence. To begin with, he was not particularly interested in the formal language of ancient sculptures, especially when it came to the human body. The physical presence, the weight, the volumetric modeling, the three-dimensionality of the ancient body was not of Botticelli's interest. His bodies are always very elegant, but rather flat silhouette. There is just a hint of three-dimensionality, but it is the powerful, the sharp contour line that defines them. It's not the chiaroscuro that creates volumes. Obviously, Botticelli knew very well his ancient sources. Venus is clearly based on the Venus pudica, but the impression is that he's not necessarily working in response to a specific ancient object. Rather, he's working with a type, with a motif. The Venus pudica was a very well-known type of Venus. Already in the very early 14th century, the sculptor Giovanni Pisano uses the Venus pudica as the inspiration for his allegorical figure of Prudence in the Cathedral of Pisa. So the idea is that Botticelli is rather adapting a well-known motif from antiquity to a context. In this case, it is actually, it works very well because the context is a mythological story, but this is a motif that can be also used for a Christian allegorical image. Something similar happens in the Primavera, where the three dancing maidens, the hours, the ore, could have been based, of course, on the Roman group of the three graces, but they're also very close to the Roman type of the dancing nymph, which is found in many Roman marble reliefs. And if you look at this detail in particular, I think you notice how the elongated proportions, the elegance of the floating drapery, the transparency of the drapery, these are all elements that we find in Botticelli's painting. So it is as if Botticelli was looking at antiquity as a repertoire of different motifs that he valued especially for their elegance, for their decorative value, and that he could easily take out of their original context and rearrange in an entirely new composition. In the case of the Primavera, this works very well with the content of the painting, because there isn't a single ancient mythological source that accounts for this specific congregation of characters. This is a sort of pastiche of elements taken from different sources, Ovid, Virgil, Terentius. But put together, they create something new. It's a new invention. And this becomes, I think, a good metaphor of Renaissance art and its relationship with ancient art. Every single Renaissance artist developed his own way to look at ancient art. Some copied the formal language, others took an inspiration in terms of iconographies and compositions. But one thing remains, sure, we could not have Renaissance art without antiquity, even though, antiquity inspired a variety of very different creative responses. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Professor De Croce, for the interesting presentation. So now we'd like to invite Dr. Marco Caboara to give his presentation. So Dr. Caboara is Digital Scholarship and Archives Manager at the Li Shaoqi Library, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. As the Archives Manager, he's in charge of the library's special collections, most prominently of the antique maps of China collection. And he studied in Italy, Taiwan, Beijing, and Hong Kong, and received his PhD from the University of Washington with a study of the linguistic features of classical Chinese bamboo manuscripts. So he's now working on a comprehensive cartobibliography of Western printed maps of China from 1584 to 1735. So let's welcome Dr. Caboara to present his topic, Botticelli's Florence between Athens and America, from the Renaissance of ancient Greek culture to the discovery of the New World. Dr. Caboara, please.
Thank you. Many thanks to the Art Museum and to Amy for the presentation. Now, I will leave really art history now and go into the history of scientific knowledge. But at the same time, something will remain similar, the visual elements. I will talk about cartography, which is the representation of the Earth and of different countries in maps. And I will talk about illustrated ancient scientific texts, in good part building on what we have in the special collections of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Now, I will articulate my talk into mainly three parts. I will first show how the Renaissance is a movement that goes back to antiquity, but not only in terms of recovering an artistic language, but also in terms of recovering a knowledge of the world of science, of the Earth, that was conveyed in texts that been written in Greek were of very limited reach in the Middle Ages. The part of the Renaissance is really the going back to ancient sources and Greek sources that made available knowledge about science and specifically geography. The second part of my presentation will focus on specifically geography and one geographer, Ptolemy, the most important of ancient astronomers and geographers, and I'll mention why both these topics are relevant. And the last goes back to the title of my talk, the discovery of America and the role of Florence in that. And that's something that happened in Botticelli's time and involved Florentine, very famous Florentine Amerigo Vespucci that gives his name to America, but quite counterintuitively does it, even though we all attribute the discovery of America to Columbus. And I will explain why this happened, which kind of connection brought his name basically to stand for a continent that was actually discovered by not a Florentine, but a Genoese as Columbus. Now, let me first mention the different dimensions of the Renaissance as we see it, from the very naming, this resurgence of ancient knowledge. Initially was related both to philosophy and politics, but now is often related to art. Then I will really focus on the translations from Greek and how Florence had a special role into this recovery of Greek sources and how this led to scientific discoveries or rediscoveries that fueled the scientific revolution. Now, two figures of the Renaissance that are showcased into the Botticelli exhibition, and these paintings you could see in the exhibition when hopefully they will be again available to the public, are Lorenzo de' Medici. He was basically the patron of much of the art done at the time and the ruler, informal ruler of Florence on the left, and Marsilio Ficino on the right. Well, Marsilio Ficino was a scholar, and he translated Plato into Latin. All these ancient Greek texts were mostly first translated into Latin, only later translated into so-called vulgar languages, Italian and other modern European languages. But he didn't only translate Plato and didn't only play a role in the recovery of philosophy, but also in other kind of texts, wide range of texts. Now, if we look at the relationship between art and antiquity, we see in Botticelli's case, as Alessandra has just shown, this recovery of motifs. Sometimes they are related to specific objects. In Botticelli's case, they are more really like motifs that are reappropriated. But at the same time, Botticelli, as we can also see in the exhibition, had a wide variety of languages. The relation to antiquity was only one of them. Much was also very Christian. In fact, what we have here in the exhibition is very Christian. The Birth of Venus is obviously related to non-Christian elements, to pagan elements, and that has to do with the patronage of Lorenzo and his circle. And this also is a painting that I will come back to, because it has a feature that connects it to Vespucci, to the discoverer of America. We'll show it at the end. Again, it's a completely classical and non-Christian painting. But if we go to another extremely famous painting, the School of Athens, but basically a representation by Raphael of this ideal world of antiquity that inspires the art of the time, we will see that here, beyond the central figures, Plato and Aristotle, there is a side where Ptolemy, actually, and Euclid, these Greek scientists, are performing their operations. Now, these Greek scientists became available in texts that were copied in Italy. This manuscript, for example, is from Pausanias, a Greek geographer. They were copied in Italy, in most cases taken from Greece, but it also recovered from ancient libraries. And they were made part again of a flow of knowledge that was really becoming alive. Now, here we see Marsilio Ficino, again, this great philosopher, but also this great expert in Greek text, near Paolo Toscanelli. Paolo Toscanelli is one of the major figures of Florentine science at the time. And being conversant in science at the time really meant to be able to read Greek texts, scientific texts, that would allow a new understanding, really an updated understanding of geography, geometry, analysis, mathematics. In fact, we know that Toscanelli had a relationship with Columbus and gave him advice in planning, basically, his trip to the Americas. Now, here I'm just giving you a visual tour of some of the texts that actually are in our collection. Some of them are later than in Botticelli's time, but most of these translations had been done before or around Botticelli's time, from Greek into Latin. And then they got printed. One of them is Euclid. And here we see how basically this knowledge was represented visually in a way that could be used. Another is Apollonius. These texts were, many of them, not accessible at all in Latin, so they were not accessible at all to people that were not deeply involved in Greek knowledge, and that knowledge really became available only in 1400, in many cases in late 1400. These translations came to the market, were printed often in the late 1400, early 1500, then printed and reprinted in a way that became part of the normal knowledge of scholars and intellectuals, just the same way that scholars all over the world access now knowledge in English as a medium. This is one example of Archimedes, and in this case, the text, the Greek text, is facing the Latin translation, but then there is a long explanation in Latin that allows you to understand the details of this explanation. And scholars like Galilei had really as their university basic function. The courses they were teaching were often courses where they would have to explain this Greek text to the students as a way to impart them knowledge about geometry, physics, astronomy. One of the great scholars of antiquity that became available in Latin and got printed was Ptolemy. Now, Ptolemy has two main specialties. One has to do with astronomy, the other with geography. Now, what we see here for astronomy is here a representation of the distance between the sun and the earth and ways to measure this distance. They were so influential that they really reconfigured the understanding of the cosmos as a unified spheric model that put together the heaven and the earth. From the critical understanding of Ptolemy's comes the Copernican revolution, because obviously Ptolemy had a model, the so-called Ptolemaic model, with the earth at the center of the world. The Ptolemaic revolution is in fact to put the sun at the center of the universe. At the same time, the two models are related. One is a transformation of the other. Now, after having given you this brief overview of this scientific element of the Renaissance, let me go to Ptolemy, and especially to what was the understanding of geography in the 1400s, more or less at the time that the Greek text of Ptolemy was reaching the West and being translated into Latin, become part of a new conversation, of a new renewing of tradition, this renaissance of ancient knowledge. What was available in the West were maps that were actually quite accurate, especially for the Mediterranean. They were called portolans, from Italian porto, harbor. So it was maps that measured the distance between harbors in the Mediterranean. And there were also maps of the world that would give a wide understanding of the relationship between Europe and the rest of Asia and Africa. But to this, the Greek text of Ptolemy added two components that were really revolutionary. One was the fact that there was a list of 8,000 toponym place names with coordinate, parallel, and meridians that allowed to situate them on maps. This was really a wealth of information that was not available to the non-Greek-speaking part of the world until the text of Ptolemy got translated in 1400. The other thing was that these maps that came together with the text of Ptolemy were finally providing a model of projection, meaning of a way to transfer the spheric part, image of the Earth into a plane that was truly the basis of later cartography, basically the drawing of maps. Now, this is a portolan map. It shows the Mediterranean. You can see the outline of Italy, and then Greece, Turkey, and Northern Africa. And these kind of maps was first developed actually in the Italian centers of trade, Genova and Pisa and Venice, then became prevalent across the Mediterranean. This other image of the world this is a non-Ptolemaic image, an image that doesn't receive the influence of the Greek geographer. And it actually provides a wide understanding of the world. There is Africa here, Europe, and it goes up to China. This is the so-called Mappamondo Genovese. It means the map of the world created in Genova in 1457. Now, this wide understanding of the world, we can compare it to a map that was created in China, the Daming Hongyitu, at the very beginning of the Ming Dynasty. We can compare it because both of these maps go back to the Mongolian Empire in China ruling the Yuan Dynasty that allowed a flow of information between China and Europe through the Silk Road, and allowed, for example, in this map of the world, because this is a map where China is very visible, at the same time, in the left part, here we have Africa. Obviously, the map is extremely large, so it would take a long analysis to show how what is barely visible in this image actually relates to the map. This map is held in Beijing. But anyway, this is the southern tip of Africa, and here at the top, there is actually Europe. Now, because of coloration, the Mediterranean is not visible as blue. The sea is basically blue everywhere. It should be blue here too. A better image, and this map is relatively accessible now, will allow you to understand that in this map, both Africa and Europe are represented, and as they were in the so-called Mappamondo Genovese, that means that had this Genoese produced a world map that had both Europe, China, and all of Asia. Now, when we go to Ptolemy, and the map's coming from Ptolemy, this is a Greek map that basically goes back to a manuscript now in Venice. And this Greek map, from a certain point of view, is a step backward. So this is quite important to understand that the influence of Greek knowledge, and especially in geography, is from a point of view a step forward because of the modern models of projections, the coordinates, the large list of place names. At the same time, this is the world that has nothing to do with the Mongolian Empire and the Silk Road. This is a world that was known to Ptolemy, the same scholar in Alexandria in the 3rd century AD that created this model of astronomy. And for him, the world was really Northern Africa, Europe, and a part of Asia. This is simply the Greek, the Latin translation of the Greek manuscript, almost identical to the one that we saw in the image before, up to the point of having Greek names that are simply transliterated into Latin, even without really giving an explanation. They are a way to take this manuscript Greek knowledge and transporting it to a Latin-speaking audience. At the same time, there were parts of the world, as in this case, Sri Lanka. This was one of the maps of Asia. Now, for Ptolemy, there was an image of the world that was actually not given in the manuscript. It was supposedly the whole world as known to the ancient, and here we see it. But this was only the general map, not particularly important for him. The focus for him was 26 regional maps. There were 12 for Asia, and then 10 for Europe, and then there were 4 for Africa. One of them here is Sri Lanka. Now, it's called map 12 because there was a clear order. The map 12 was always Sri Lanka. It was outsized. But I also wanted to show it to you not only because the Greek map is paired to the Latin ones, but because the Latin one was created by the uncle of Amerigo Vespucci, a scholar in Greek that basically oversaw the education of Amerigo Vespucci in geography. This is a Ptolemaic map of the world, but at the same time here we really see how this image of the world is adapted to a visual style that is meant to serve for luxury manuscript, given initially to princes in the Renaissance and some royal houses in Europe. There were all the major nobles and kings would have a codex, basically a manuscript of Ptolemy with maps. And here you see basically these heads for the winds that have been added. And this is still a manuscript, but this is the first printed version of Ptolemy. And it's very similar in visual style to the preceding one. It has been hand-colored after having been printed. This is the third edition, actually the printed edition of Ptolemy. There was a first edition in 78 in Bologna, then one in 1480 in Rome. This is the third in Ulm in 1482. But they were all printed by German printers because the art of printing was developed in Germany around 1450. And even in Italy, the first printers were Germans. Now, this is a map that we have in our collection in University of Science and Technology. And it's quite interesting because it takes many of the elements of the previous maps with the headwinds and the division of the world in three parts, but puts it in a large illustrated printed book that talks about the development of the whole world history. Puts it also in a Christian context with the three sons of Noah at the three sides, associated each one with a continent, Ham, Sem, and Japheth. And also puts it together with these creatures, this monstrous creature that supposedly populate the outer edges of the world, that from a European point of view means everything outside of Europe. This, again, is one of the maps of Asia, number 8. It's basically a map that stretches roughly to the easternmost part of Asia that was known to Ptolemy. Here we can see Serica, the land of silk. That was the old name of China for the Latins. And the map in itself is, by Münster in 1540, is a map whose main structure is actually a fairly abstract, known visual representation of the world with the different zones and numerical data, but at the same time being commercial printed cartography. There were elements that were basically just visual elements alluring for the readers, like the cannibals in the top parts, and this monstrous creature, just like we saw before, in the outer parts. So cartography, especially printed cartography, had been for a long time associating these more geometrical elements to visually engaging additional elements that were mainly used just to give more appeal to the book. Now, with the discoveries of the Portuguese in Africa, down the coast up to the southern tip, the model of the world that was known to Ptolemy, which was only limited to northern Africa and 2/3 of Asia, starts expanding. This is one of the representation of an expanded Ptolemaic maps of the world. And this is a globe that was produced the very year that America was discovered. It was a globe, so this is just actually taken from a website that allow you to view a globe that is actually a normal sphere that was created in Nuremberg in 1492. It's very famous. It's the Beheim globe. And this globe allows you to see that where we now know is America, there was just an empty space, but it also allows you to see that due to the limited knowledge of Ptolemy and the calculation that they made at the time about the size of the Earth, it was imagined that the distance between Europe and East Asia was actually much, much shorter than we know it to be now. So this was basically the image before Columbus sailed from Spain to, in his mind, China and bumping into America and discovering America. Now, the last part of my talk is about how Columbus' discovery of America and Vespucci's travel, basically, were narrated and basically made available to the public in a way that created our modern names and also shaped the consciousness of European intellectuals and actually common people for at least a century. That means after Columbus discovered America, the naming and basically the main understanding of America as a new world became something that was rather attributed to a Florentine scholar than to the original discoverer. And in fact, it is really connected to the intellectual history of the time, how the role of Columbus as basically a sailor was considered less important than the intellectual process of understanding America as a new world and being able to discuss it in a Ptolemaic fashion, in a way that refers to this Greek knowledge about the world. Now, America was discovered in 1492, meaning this is the first trip by Columbus. This is the first map that actually in this part for America has the name of Columbus. It's a manuscript map of 1506. There is simply a mention that Columbus landed in these western lands. But just 1 year later, we have a printed map in 1507. This is a map that is now at the Library of Congress. It had been a printed map. There were a large number of copies being produced, but only one remains. So this is one of the most rare maps, and the map for whom the price paid has been the highest in the history of printed maps, acquired by the Library of Congress a few decades ago from a German collector. Now, this map has the name America. If we compare the mention of the two cartographers, we see here, basically, in the area of the Caribbean, the mention of Columbus. And instead, here we see the name America, which was actually given not to the whole continent, but only to the southern part. This is where Amerigo Vespucci landed. Amerigo Vespucci had to travel around 10 years after Columbus in 1502. So the contribution of the two discoverers is on one side in a cartouche, in a portion of text that mentioned that Columbus went there. In the other is really the name of a new area with a ship here being shown. But even more importantly, in the upper part of the map by Walsemiller, another very large map in 12 sheets, the two central ones at the top. On one side have Ptolemy. Here we see him dressed basically in Oriental fashion. Ptolemy was from Egypt, so he's dressed a bit like a mixture between an ancient and an Egyptian. And on the other hand, Amerigo Vespucci. Now, Ptolemy is facing a map that is roughly the Ptolemaic map of the world that we saw before. Africa is more extended to the south than the traditional Ptolemaic maps. But on the other hand, is not complete. Not all of Africa is shown. The southern tip is not shown. This is what the ancient didn't know about, basically the possibility to navigate around the southern tip of Africa and reach the Indian Ocean. And also Asia is only represented up to a point. There is no ocean to the right. In the Ptolemaic maps, This part was unknown. And exactly to the right, this is the complementary part, is that now we know that on one hand there is America, even though the southern tip is known and represented relatively well. The northern part is really quite unknown, but it's a new world. And also, the other part of the new world is East Asia, where we're now. I mean, East Asia with the sea coast represented. This is the new world. So in this map, we see paired the knowledge of the old world and the old cartography, Ptolemy, and the knowledge of the new world and the new cartography, whose main protagonist is Amerigo Vespucci. Now, why did that happen? Especially because now, when we talk about Vespucci, often we just have kind of trouble to explain how his name got connected with such an important discovery, and we need to motivate why the name that we all know, Columbus, was kind of sidelined for quite a while. How did it happen? Well, this is Europe at the time of the Columbus and Vespucci travels. And the maps that we saw have been produced in Italy and in Germany. And the main interest, well, the main sea powers, the one that went to America was Spain. Portugal was going around the Africa to reach the Indian Ocean. These were producing basically geographical data, but at the same time, this data was being used by cartographers and basically printing centers in Germany and in Italy, and they would serve the interests of these centers. And so what people saw at the time in terms of the appropriation of this knowledge of cartography was related to these centers that were big commercial and industrial centers. There was basically almost no production of printed maps at all in Spain and Portugal for centuries. All the new discoveries were printed in Italy and Germany. Now, when Columbus reached America, he wrote a letter in Spanish. And that letter got translated after just 1 year in Latin, from Spanish into Latin. That was the language that allowed for European diffusion, basically circulation. So this is a basic schema of how that first book with the letter of Columbus circulated. It was first printed in Barcelona, then had a small diffusion in Spain, that basically the center where it was printed most times, the numbers are the numbers of editions of that small booklet, 9 times in Rome. And from Rome, it got diffused. So basically that was the pattern, and that reflected basically the fact that the Spanish royals wanted to convey to the Pope, first of all, the importance of the discovery. And there was soon a treaty in the Treaty of Tordesillas that basically got the Pope to draw a line that attributed to Spain all the new part of the world that they discovered. So for them, it was very important that that knowledge reached Rome, and through Rome, some other centers in Europe. Instead, the letter by Vespucci had a very different pattern of diffusion. Knowledge got spread in a very different way. He wrote, Vespucci actually wrote letters to the Medici, that was his patron in Florence, already in 1502. But for a few years, there was no special diffusion of these letters. Then they got printed. And when they got printed, they became a much larger publication success than Columbus' letter. It was around 15 years later. And the way they got diffused was this. So not through Spain to Rome, but initially they were printed in Paris and then mostly in German centers. the fact that the letter got spread in German center reflected the other big commercial power at the time. The Medici in Florence were a big banking dynasty, but an even bigger banking dynasty at the time were the Fugger in southern Germany, in Augsburg. And they had strong interest in the spice trade with Portugal, and they really pushed the diffusion of these books. So the way, and the map that we saw in 1507 that names America is the map by a German, Waldseemüller. So basically, the naming of America is basically something that was done mixing this Florentine background with the German commercial interest. Now, I want to give a final small overview of a second kind of refreshed assertion of the influence of Vespucci. This is from a series of prints that was done by an artist, Stradanus. Actually, it's just the Latinized name of a Flemish, basically from Belgium, an artist from Belgium, but that was very long active in Florence. His series Nova Reperta, the New Discoveries, is very influential. It has been shown in any text that basically talks about the new discovery that made the scientific revolution. There is the gunpowder, and actually central to all the scientific discovery is here the discovery of America. Here we see this a print about the discovery of America, and we have side to side Vespucci and Columbus. Now, at that time, Vespucci had actually become much less prominent. Waldseemüller himself, who made this map in 1507, giving the name to America, never used that name anymore, and he made many more maps. For the German cartographer, and actually in general for cartographers, the name remained just because of a continuing tradition, but the role of Vespucci was considered less and less important. But at this time, in around 1590, the 100 years of discovery of America was approaching, and the Medici again wanted to bolster the role of Florence in the discovery of America, a role that actually was always very minor, but for them, through this artist, Stradanus, and to this basically work on what the new discovery that created a new understanding of the world was, it was very important that, again, Vespucci had this prominence. And here we see two images. Here we see Vespucci looking at the North Star, having the astrolabe, and basically behaving as an intellectual, a scholar. And for them, that was the important thing, basically that for the cartographers that were also humanists, Vespucci was basically a kindred soul. I mean, someone that could use a sophisticated model to understand what that was discovered. Instead, if we look at the discovery of America, also in the Stradanus, the thing is, here we have an image that actually has been studied very much lately in terms of this European looking at the naked body of America and appropriating this new continent. But at the same time, Columbus is simply a person that goes into a new land and make this encounter. But the one that is able to give a meaning to the new encounter is Vespucci with the astrolabe and with the knowledge that goes back to Greek knowledge. So the final image that I want to show you is simply this. We saw initially Mars and Venus. This is back at the head of Mars. there is this nests of wasps. Now, wasps are Vespae. We know that the Vespucci family commissioned that painting. So basically, the connection of Vespucci to the cultural and financial elite of Florence played a big role in the naming of America. And we go back this way to Botticelli. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Caballera, for your interesting topic. So let's have our Q&A session. So for the audience sitting in front of your computer, feel free to leave your questions in the chat box, which is right next on the right-hand side of your screen. So while we're waiting for the questions, let's have our discussion first. Okay, so for me, I do have some questions for you guys. So first of all, like for Professor De Croce, so like you mentioned about the antiques, that were being studied and found in the Renaissance paintings. I just want to learn a little bit more, about when the artists, because most of the paintings, they were commissioned projects. So in terms of the composition and the employment of antiquities, I just wonder if the commissioners, had any input, usually, in that sense.
Well, certainly it depends from who was the person who commissioned the work. We can imagine that in the case, for instance, of Botticelli's paintings, certainly the patron had a big role. The Primavera, in terms of the content and the mythological allegory, Botticelli did not work by himself. He was probably helped by a member of the Medici circle, most likely the poet Angelo Poliziano. In many instances, the artist was not working entirely by himself. That being said, if we think about Michelangelo at work in the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo was pretty much thinking about the composition, thinking about the iconography, and thinking about the formal appearance of his figures by himself. So it really depends on the artist and the patron. I would say that in many cases the artist was guided by the patron and perhaps by some counselor. In other instances, such as, for instance, the Sistine Chapel, the artist was working by himself.
Mm-hmm. So, for the accessibility of the antiquities, when the artists wanted to study, so were they usually through, for example, the patron, the Medici family, or do you have any sources that you can elaborate more?
Do you mean accessibility to the objects?
Yeah,
from
to the
part
objects.
Of the artist?
Yeah.
Someone like Michelangelo, for instance, to talk about him again, had free access to all of the marbles, first in the collection of the Medici family when he was a young artist in training in Florence, late 15th century Florence. Later on, he had the privileged access to all the marbles that were in the collection of the popes in Rome. Michelangelo worked for, I think as many as 5 popes, I want to say, 4 popes. Several popes, and all of them obviously granted him access to all of the objects. But there were also many drawings that were circulating. In the 16th century, prints played a huge role in the diffusion of knowledge of antiquities. So if an artist did not have a direct access to the ancient marbles, whether because the marble in question was part of a private collection and he couldn't see it, or because perhaps the artist was living elsewhere, northern artist, for instance. So there were often prints who could provide it, some sort of access to the ancient object.
Mm-hmm. And also, for example, you quoted an example of the boy with the thorn. So, like for that one, like I just wonder, I just trying to imagine, like during that time, was it like something suddenly become like a popular subject? So like artists during the, in the same circle, they would share the same idea and they would try to include in their paintings?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it was, in the case of the boy with the thorn, the Spinarius, it was a very popular motif rather than, it didn't have a specific meaning or it was not connected to a specific story, right? So it was a very convenient, all'antica in Italian it's said, like ancient looking motif that could be easily inserted in any kind of composition as a way to please the viewers, as a way to signal the knowledge of antiquity from the part of the artist, which is, we may assume, the reason why we find the Spinarius in Botticelli, in Signorelli, in Perugino, I mean, in several of the fresco painted in the Sistine Chapel. Each one of them wanted to show to the viewers, his understanding and knowledge of antiquity.
Yeah, interesting. So a question for Dr. Cavallaro. In your presentation, you mentioned about the role of Vespucci's family, in terms of, exploring the world and, their navigation. So I just wonder, because in our exhibition, we did mention quite a lot about the Medici family, the role of Medici family in terms of supporting the artists, the literati circle. So, so I just want to see, if, can you elaborate a little bit more, if you have any information about the role of the Medici family in terms of, doing these kind of exploration or discovery of new lands?
Well, really, the importance for the Medici, not only in Lorenzo de' Medici's time and in Vespucci's time. Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492, the same year of the discovery of America. Yeah. So that was basically the highest point of the patronage in terms of Botticelli. But then we go back. I showed a painting of Ficino and Toscanelli done by Vasari. So Vasari actually created for the Medici family the first museum, we know, the Uffizi. And in 1590, again, the Medici, that was done by Cosimo de' Medici, and then the Medici went back basically doing patronage for the Stradanos series. So the Medici wanted to play up their role in discoveries because it was clearly the discoveries that were done by the Portuguese and the Spanish created a new world. But their role at the time, for example, with Vespucci, was that they were basically just bankers. I mean, Vespucci was in Spain and Lisbon connected with their banking business. But also because he was in Spain at the time and Columbus' discovery came at the time, he got involved into this new adventure. And then the other part of Florence's power at the time was as a kind of a network for diffusing knowledge. So Vespucci wrote a letter to the Medici as his patrons and told them what he found. Now, that letter actually is a manuscript letter, and when Vespucci's booklet really was printed again in Paris and then by the Germans, that letter has been transformed a lot. I mean, it was a letter in Italian, the letter got translated into Latin, and it got completely, it magnified the role of Vespucci. At the same time, the family, the Medici family really got sidelined, much more than say, Genova or Venice, that were still commercial centers. And it was a challenge for all of Italy. The discovery of America was a challenge, because suddenly, from a world that is dominated by the Mediterranean and that gets access to the Indian Ocean through the Middle East, through the connection that these cities had with Egypt, with Syria, suddenly you get a new model where the ship just depart in the Atlantic. So there is no way for the Italians anymore to claim to have control over this exploration. But the two largest commercial centers at the time were South Germany, the figure, and then different commercial interests in Italy. They used that information for their own purposes, and they basically tried to finance all these trips. But they never really had the first-hand role in discovery. But in diffusing knowledge, yes, in making a claim to why that knowledge is a knowledge that is really important for history, yes. Also the fact that the discovery of America is now the standard breaking point for the modern age now, 1492. Well, that's also quite a point of view that is not that relevant, for example, for the Germans that under Luther thought that the Reformation was the most important event, or the Eastern European that thought that the fall of Constantinople, Istanbul, was the most important event. There are three possible breaking points for the modern age, but the one that won is 1492, at least won until now in our books. And that has to do with the control of the Medici and other basically Italian families over how you frame the narrative.
Great. So I just wonder, like, for the new discovery of America, so how did the artists during that time respond to this new discovery? Is there like any text or like some records that we can know a little bit more about how, I don't know, like, not only artists, maybe like, the whole circle of poets, writers, philosophers, like all these literary circle, I just wonder how they responded to this new discovery.
Well, I don't know. You have anything to say on your side?
Well, I don't think that for a list, initially, I don't think it had such a large impact on the let's say the general public. No, it probably took some time before the novelty of this new world came to be known by people outside the small circle of the explorers and I guess I don't know.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too, because I think they could. That's why I was thinking about the accessibility. So probably they.
Well, basically, as I show in the two small graphs about the diffusion of print, so printing had started being a major medium of diffusing knowledge. So these letters were printed immediately and reprinted and created maps. Now, some really had great expectation about what that would mean for even the world. Columbus himself had really thought that basically the discovery of America, this new world, would really be a new beginning in a very deep sense, really, like in the same sense that apocalyptic believers believe that the world is renewed by this big new revelation. He had that mindset. There were Europeans, Christians, that really thought that what was a new beginning, maybe really the end itself of the world, and they even connected with the lost tribe of Israel. Everything got together into this big narration. For commercial people that knew the commercial reality, it was a big news. I mean, in Venice, they said after they got this news, again, through the print, it was like received as a tragedy, basically. At the same time, when you see for the general European public, people who study collection of books of travels and representation of foreign, basically, countries, always say that it's quite evident there was more written about Turkey than about America for at least 50 years. From 1492 until 1550, the Turks were a danger. People were very worried about it everywhere. And now we think that Turkey in 1550, people should have thought about what it meant to discover a new world. But we know that people were more interested about Turkey in terms of publications. At the same time, especially at the time of the second series of Stradano, around 1580, 1590, if we look at what philosopher would say about the New World, the great philosopher of the late 1500s, Montaigne and Francis Bacon, they really thought that it was a new universe that they could discover, and it would give really a new way to look at things. But it took a while. It really took a while.
By that time, there was also a new interest from the part of the church, right? That, following the Protestant Reformation, had lost part of its flock in Europe, and so was desperately looking for new people to convert to Christianity in the new world, obviously. So by the late 16th century, there was, as you said, like a new or a much more diffused interest in the new
And in
continent.
fact, for China too, and Japan too. With the Jesuits coming here and thought that they could really renew Christianity here. Yeah.
By gaining as many people as possible to the
Right.
faith.
Yeah. I just thought of a question for Professor De Croce. Talking about the revival of antiquities in the Renaissance period, can you explain more about the difference? So now we know that the Renaissance, during the Renaissance, the artists, they tried to include or employ the antiquities from the Greek period or the ancient Roman to the Renaissance period. But what are the differences then, in terms of techniques, or some of the new inventions during the Renaissance, which is reinterpret
From antiquity, you mean? Well, the first difference that comes to my mind is the different way to represent the space. For instance, three-dimensional space. The depiction of a three-dimensional space disappears completely from European art during the Middle Ages. We have very flat, bidimensional images. It is only in the 15th century that, already in the 14th century, but in the 15th century, a way to project three-dimensionality onto a flat surface becomes codified. And it's the what we call the vanishing point perspective, which is a geometrical construction of space. In antiquity, there was not vanishing point perspective. It was a different way to create the illusion of three-dimensional space. So that's definitely one of the first things that comes to my mind. In terms of techniques, there was a lot of interest in learning again skills that had been lost. For instance, Donatello, who is the first one to experiment with a bronze monument of that size in the equestrian monument for Gattamelata. So in terms of painting, the biggest innovation is the use of oil painting that comes from Northern Europe. In Italy, the use of oil painting can be dated to the late 15th century. So that's a technique that was definitely new. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I think it's more or less. I think it comes to an end. So thank you so much again for Professor De Croce and Dr. Marco Caboara, and also thank you for our last talk speakers, Dr. Isabel Frank and also Ms. Esther Chalak. And once again, I need to thank the Italian Cultural Institute for providing this platform to make this live streaming possible. So thank you, everyone, for your participation, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.